So you're dating a non-believer. Let's talk about it. And I'm going to get real close to the camera and hold your hand as I gently say this. Dating that non-believer is not part of God's goodwill for your life, sis. Or boy, we don't discriminate over here. Let's unpack. Hi, my name is Nkirata Mtisia. I make faith-based lifestyle content, and today we are digging into the topic of whether there's a real future for a union between a Christian and a non-Christian. Now, before we get into the gist of the conversation, I think it would be proper for us to understand together, or rather have a shared understanding of what dating is. I'd say dating is spending time with someone of the opposite sex with the hopes of getting into a romantic relationship that could potentially lead to marriage. And the emphasis on marriage is very important for us as believers, because we know that the intended design for sex by God was to be enjoyed within the covenant of marriage. So marriage is seen as this container, I would say, where sex can be had lawfully, can be had morally, and can be had like you can enjoy sex basically. And that's why we see fornication, which is sex before marriage, as a sin in the Bible. So if you are not married, if you are not in a relationship, if you are not dating for marriage, the advice from the Bible is that you are to treat everyone of the opposite sex as your brother and sister in Christ. And this we actually see in 1 Timothy chapter 5 verse 1 to 2. Do not rebuke an older man, but exhort him as a father, younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, younger women as sisters with all purity. The Greek word that is translated as purity in this verse actually points to chastity, which is abstaining from sex. Now that we've established dating is for marriage and marriage only, let's move ahead and look at the purpose of marriage by the one who instituted it, who is God himself. So obviously the first time we see this concept of marriage is the creation story between Adam and Eve. Genesis chapter 2 verse 18 says, God saw it was not fit for man to be alone. So we would say one of the purposes of marriage is companionship, and this entire idea of having a helpmate, which is the reason why God created Eve for Adam. We have also other purposes or reasons for marriage, such as procreation, which I guess is part of, marriage being the container of sex. And it's also a symbolism or a picture of Christ and the church. So the sacrificial love of Christ and the church basically serving Christ and being devoted to him for the rest of their lives. So now let's get back to our question. Should a Christian date someone of the opposite sex and potentially marry them, and this person does not profess the faith? My answer is an emphatic no, and it goes back to one of the purposes of marriage that I've just highlighted, which is to be symbolism for the love between Christ and the church. My first question would be, how does someone love like the church, or even love like Christ, depending on whether you're the husband or wife, if you have not been inwardly transformed by this very same love? And we know from the Bible, I think it's 1 John chapter 4 verse 8 that says God is love, and we often talk about how it is impossible to love in a God way if you have not been transformed by God himself, or you have not experienced the glory of God. And for me, it just, when I think about it more and more, I'm just like, how can an unbeliever pursue to love like Christ if you're the husband, or to lay down and be devoted to your husband like the church if you are the wife, if you have not been inwardly transformed by this love? I just don't see it, guys. Colossians chapter 3 verse 23 says, do everything as unto the Lord. And so how do you date someone or marry someone who does not glorify God as unto the Lord? And here's the thing, guys, by worldly standards, this person, this babe or this guy could be a good person. They are kind, they are compassionate, they have really great relationships. All of that is good for them. But what does our faith say? As Christians, we believe that we are justified by faith and not by works. So the good works before the Lord actually doesn't mean anything if they have not accepted the sacrifice of God. And when you really begin to dig deeper into the scriptures and see how unbelievers are described, whether it is a good person or not, this is an enemy of the Lord. This is someone who has rejected Jesus. The Bible talks about them as being slaves to their passion and pleasures. Now, when you start to see this person the way God sees them, I ask again the question, how do you date, or how do you marry this person in a way that is glorifying and honoring of God? Like, how do you build a life with someone who hates the very Jesus that you worship and you serve and you have laid down your life for? One of the most popular verses that is often referenced when having this discourse, the one on unequally yoked, is 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 14 to 16a, and we'll read it together. Do not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers, for what fellowship has righteousness with lawlessness? And what communion has light with darkness? And what accord has Christ with Belial? Or what part has a believer with an unbeliever? And what agreement has the temple of God with idols? For you are the temple of the living God. The Message version says, don't become partners with those who reject God. How can you make a partnership out of right and wrong? That's not partnership, that's war. Is light best friends with dark? Does Christ go strolling with the devil? Do trust and mistrust hold hands? Who will think of setting up pagan idols in God's holy temple? But that is exactly what we are. Each of us a temple in whom God lives. God himself put it this way: I'll live in them, move into them, I'll be their God and they'll be my people. So leave the corruption and compromise. Leave it for good, says God. Don't link up with those who will pollute you. I want you all for myself. I'll be a father to you. You'll be sons and daughters to me. The word of the Master God. Let's underscore some important words or like recurring themes in this passage. We have fellowship, agreement, partnership, accord, communion. Like these are all things that the author of this passage, I believe Paul, 1 Corinthians, is saying cannot exist between right and wrong, cannot exist between light and darkness. When we think about the phrase unequally yoked, it's actually borrowed from an old-time practice, so back in those days, where two oxen would be yoked or tied together in order to work the land. Now, if you take an obviously stronger ox and yoke it together with a weaker one, there would be an equal partnership. So it would be hard for them to work the land effectively. Either the stronger one would, maybe refuse to do the work because it's just not working out, or they would try to do it and they wouldn't complete it well. And I feel like when we think about this story, when we think about this analogy, two things stand out for me. One is the fact that in such an unequal partnership, it is more often the stronger one that bears the brunt of it. Like, it's not the weaker one that anaumia, it's the stronger ox in this situation. And two, there's specific work, or there's a specific task that these two people, if we think about it in the context of marriage and relationships, there's a particular purpose that they've been brought together and that they need to accomplish. Which then leads me to my next sentiment. When you think about every single person has been created with a specific God-given purpose, I don't see how getting together in an unequally yoked partnership will allow you to achieve or fulfill this purpose that God has placed on your life. And just the other day, I had another thought that added to my, my reasoning of this entire situation, is that it's not enough to just have like your partner allow you to do things or like cheer you on by the sidelines. But it's very important that you are heading the same direction and that they are actually one of your biggest supporters. Like they are actually working for your benefit and for your good, whether that is financial support, emotional support. It's not just by standing and being like, yeah, girl, like you want to go into ministry, do ministry. But then they're not covering you in prayer. They're not actively enabling you to push further than you would go if you are doing it alone, which I think is then the picture that is being created. Like these two oxen had to work the land. That was the purpose for both of them. And so by them coming together, they're able to fulfill this thing in a much easier and faster way because of the union. But if you come together with an unbeliever, it just becomes incredibly difficult, And while yes, things may start out light in the very beginning, I think in the long run, the stronger one or the believer in this context will not be able to sustain the relationship because fundamentally you just don't see eye to eye on many things. How do you spend your finances? How do you raise your kids? Where do they go to school? Do you take them to church on Sundays? What happens when one of your children comes to you and says they are experiencing same-sex attraction? Are you reading off the same script with your partner? If you don't both align yourself to God's way, God's law, God's instructions, And while yes, these things may feel like they are at the periphery of purpose, it's still all purpose. Like when you think about yes, you've been given one thing to do in life, like this big thing, say for example ministry, but how you spend your finances, your family life, how you spend your time, where you live, these are all things that could either be makers of your purpose or breakers of your purpose. And I always hear this kafani phrase of, I don't want to marry a prayer request, I want to marry a prayer partner. So you also don't want to be spending all of your time that you should be investing in your purpose. Instead, now that is you're in warfare. You're in warfare praying for this person because you're constantly worried about where they spend eternity. Are they going to go to hell? Like, it's a lot. It's a lot. And I feel it's times 100 magnified when the unbeliever is the husband, because we all know that the husband is supposed to be the spiritual head or the spiritual covering of the family. So now if you are in this situation where the person who's supposed to be leading you is not under the leadership or the headship of God, then it just makes things even more difficult. Yeah. I think the other thing to think about beyond purpose is just like your Christian life. Like, I'm a Christian who enjoys doing Christian things. I love going for Bible studies. Like, my life is punctuated all over with several Bible studies. I like to go to church on Sundays. When I go on dates, I'm constantly speaking about God. Not just like at romantic dates, but like, like dates with friends, just hanging out, doing life. I do a lot of these things. I go for worship nights. I go, like, I love being in the presence of believers, and I love doing things out of service before God. Now imagine a situation where you cannot enjoy these things with your partner. Like you're constantly spending time, like, I don't know. I think it's beautiful, and I speak from experience. Wasn't necessarily an unbeliever, but I dated someone who I'd say was not being led by the Spirit, and was still very much in the world. And I was also much in the world at the time, so this is not all on him. But I remember, like, in the beginning, it's like, it's all fun and games, it's cute, they're passionately curious about your Christianity or like your service before God. And when they ask questions, you're very patient, you want to explain. But let me tell you, it's not always like that. And I don't think it's that the patience wears off. I think you just get tired that they don't get it. Like, you constantly have to translate and explain your passions and like why you love God and what God means to you. Like, you just want for things to happen and for both of you guys to be like, yeah, that's God, because it's such a big part of you. And obviously, this doesn't apply if you are not yet there in your own Christian journey with God. And I feel like more often than not, that's what happens. No one enters a relationship and is like, yeah, I'm going to willfully date a non-Christian because I don't care about my Christianity. No, I think these situations tend to come up when we aren't really being led by the Spirit, or we aren't as devoted. Maybe it's like a period of quote unquote backsliding. But when you get serious with God, and when God starts to really take the center stage of your life, this relationship just will not work. You are in a relationship with someone who is consistently crucifying your Christ and not accepting the sacrifice of Christ on the cross. It just doesn't make sense, guys. It just doesn't make sense. The other really big one for me is, how do I explain things of the Spirit? Now, I've done some pretty crazy, like very risky things, especially in the past 1 year, purely because the Lord told me to do it, and they worked out for my good eventually. So hallelujah, praise Jesus. But I'm imagining a situation where I am married to an unbeliever, and I come and I'm like, hey babe, God has told me that we need to sell all our possessions and move to America. Like, what? Like, guys, how do you explain that to an unbeliever? Like, logic dictates not that, everything else but not that. Or like saying things like, I had a vision, or I had a dream last night that this really good business deal that checks off all the boxes is not a wise decision. And I cannot explain it to you. I cannot give you physical evidence apart from the dream that I had last night where God spoke to me through an angel. Like, how? How do you explain things of the spirit to someone who does not have the spirit in them. And I believe the Bible talks about that, I guess in one of the epistles, you cannot understand the things of the spirit without the spirit. Those are now, I guess, some of the strains that will be there across the relationship, just because you don't read off the same script and your loves are not aligned. You don't have the same values, you don't have the same principles, you don't both believe in God. It's such a big thing. One of the things that we don't talk often about is that I believe it's possible to be unequally yoked also as two Christians, but this is purely just, I would say, like level of Christianity. Like if you are not, if one of you is fired up for the Lord and another one is not, I think that could also, in a sense, be an unequally yoked relationship. And so there's just much to be said about involving God in the dating process, involving God when you're going through premarital, when you're about to get into the covenant of marriage, because the covenant of marriage is big. Like, it's really huge. There's a verse that talks about how when you are married to an unbeliever, you are actually cautioned not to leave that relationship because your salvation covers them, and they could actually be led to salvation because of just like your good deeds and the fact that you remained with them. Now, the caveat here is, I believe these were Paul's words, and he even specifies, like, this is my advice and not the Lord's. But I believe his heart was in the right place, because the covenant of marriage is so important before the Lord. It's like, even when you've now unfortunately gotten into it with an unbeliever, the advice is against divorcing them. Purely because of the reasons I've given. And I'll leave the verse here just so that you can go and read up more on it. But even I have seen with my own eyes, from experience of close loved ones, being together with an unbeliever, it is hard. It almost feels like the strain you go through, either praying for them or like standing in agreement, fighting for the things that the Lord has placed over your heart, fighting for the achievement of your own purpose. These things come with so much difficulty. And it's like, that's the quote unquote like natural consequence of getting into a relationship with an unbeliever. So yeah, these are just some of the things I guess we need to think about when we are in that position, either when we are dating or about to get into the covenant of marriage. I'm usually very discerning. I believe even with believers, I'm just like, yeah, you're a believer, but like, just because you're a Christian doesn't mean I can date all Christians. Okay, guys, I believe in the concept of the one. I know some people don't. But yeah, I'm usually very purposeful to just ask God, like, is this the man that will be able to hold the purpose over my life well, that they can steward my purpose as well, that the way you have made them is like perfect, like the perfect concoction of personality and experiences and upbringing that would be the best environment for me to accomplish my purpose. And obviously the opposite is true. Like, I also need to be the wife that can steward my husband's purpose well and help him towards the achievement of that purpose, and not to be a barrier. The commands of the Lord are always with the intention of love. Like, God is a loving God. He never gives out his instructions or his law just because he wants us to miss out on experiences in life. It's because he is first and foremost a protector. There is no evil in God. He is a holy God. And so I guess it's for us to trust that when God says, do not be unequally yoked with an unbeliever, that there is good in that instruction, that he has already seen at the very end of our marriage, the strain or what could have been that cannot be, because we have gotten ourselves in this situation. So I pray, if you are currently struggling in like you're dating, or you've fallen in love with someone who's not who's not a believer, I genuinely pray that you take that to the Lord. I know, especially when love is involved, it makes things messier and it's like harder to cut off from this person and walk away. But I have been in some really tricky situations that I took myself there, and from like the ends of myself, I called out, I cried out to God, and I was just like, help me, because I personally, not only do I not have the strength to leave the situation, but I actually don't want to, because right now my flesh is screaming out more than my spirit, and God has come through. So I believe God is able to remove us from these situations, because at the end of the day, they're not honoring to Him. I believe He will make a way out, and He will give you the strength and ability and grace to take that way out. And even if you're married, I whatever your heart's desires are, whether that is to leave or to stay in the marriage and tarry for the salvation of your partner, I know that God is gracious, and His grace covers even our sins and our mistakes. So I pray that there's no condemnation in your situation, that truly, truly the Lord can be able to cover that. And you can know that you are still loved, that you are still you're still worthy before the Lord. And even if you feel like you have probably missed out on some part of your purpose because of being in an equally yoked relationship, we serve a God who is a restorer, and He will be able to bring back everything that the enemy has stolen because of this relationship. So may you find hope, may you find peace, and I pray that the Lord may be able to guide all of us in the different circumstances we are in regarding this matter. So yeah, be blessed, guys, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.